All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're putting on our urban investigator hats to unpack this genuinely fascinating forensic reality, why Glasgow's most intense, absolutely world-renowned football tradition literally had to be dismantled from the ground up. We're looking at the fall of the Sunday Derby between Rangers and Celtic. And we're not just looking at it as a sporting event, but as an absolute, undeniable nightmare for city planning. So let's open the case file, shall we? We're going to trace this timeline in 4 quick steps. First up, the Sunday Derby ritual. Second, we'll dive into the anatomy of the volatility. Third, the forensic case for change. And finally, we'll look at the resulting cultural scar. Okay, let's jump right into section 1, the Sunday Derby ritual. So, picture this. Back in the 80s and 90s, this massive match under the grey Glasgow sky was the undeniable anchor of the Scottish football weekend. I mean, you literally couldn't ignore it. But an immense friction was brewing. Just imagine the traditional quiet day of rest, the sacred Sabbath, colliding head-on with pure, unadulterated Derby chaos. The contrast is almost absurd when you think about it. What started as a beloved cultural ritual completely morphed into this white-hot liability that pushed Glasgow's city resources to their absolute breaking point. Which brings us to Section 2, Anatomy of the Volatility. To really understand the urban pathogen this created beyond the pitch, we have to look at the immediate structural disadvantage that authorities were dealing with. Planners call this the closed-loop conflict. Think about it. Sunday is traditionally a day of rest, right? So transport, security, police, they all naturally operate on these skeleton weekend crews. Yet, the old firm Derby demanded maximum capacity mobilization, so authorities were facing a massive spike in danger on the exact day the city's defenses were at their weakest. It's a total mismatch. And look, this wasn't just your standard football hooliganism. It was a threefold systemic failure. That closed-loop conflict we just talked about, it acted like a giant accelerant when you paired it with 2 other huge factors, a dangerous alcohol derby nexus and immense psychological pressure. Let's actually break those 2 down. First up, the alcohol derby nexus. Because pubs historically open later on Sundays, thousands of supporters would flood the streets incredibly early just to secure a spot at the bar. They were essentially drinking for hours before the whistle even blew. Actually, drinking might be putting it mildly. They were saturating the city. By the end of the match, Glasgow's narrow streets and transit lines were completely choked with thousands of highly tense, inebriated fans all moving at exactly the same time. It was a recipe for disaster. Then, you have to add in the psychological layer, Sunday lethargy. Think about the slow, sleepy pace of a traditional Sunday morning. Now, violently puncture that quiet with the extreme, unmatched adrenaline of an old firm match. That jarring transition caused massive emotional dissonance. Fans have been bottling up tension all week long, and unleashing it on a day culturally meant for rest, it resulted in incredibly aggressive, immediate reactions. Moving right along to Section 3, the forensic case for change. So, facing this perfect storm of low staffing, high intoxication, and intense psychological tension, officials realized something crucial. They weren't managing a sport anymore. They were treating a severe urban crisis. Planners and transport police gathered the data, and honestly, the forensic evidence was absolutely damning. Just look at this. Keeping the kickoff on a Sunday directly drove massive spikes in public order incidents, sharp increases in severe vandalism, and get this, it completely paralyzed the Glasgow subway system. The schedule itself was literally breaking the city's infrastructure. To survive, officials knew they had to break the cycle of the day entirely. By moving the match to Saturdays, or even better, midweek evenings, they executed a really calculated 3-step tactical fix. 1, fragment the atmosphere. 2, maximize resources. And 3, control the flow of the crowds. Let's look at step 1. Fragmenting the atmosphere was honestly a brilliant psychological tactic. If you schedule the game on a Wednesday night, you instantly prevent the all-day binge. Why? Because fans are forced to go to work or school during the day. This drastically limits their time for pre-match social cohesion in the pubs, effectively diffusing that dangerous, simmering buildup of tension before it even has a chance to start. Building on that, shifting away from Sunday finally gave the police exactly what they desperately needed: full, weekday-strength rosters. Armed with maximum resources, they could properly control how crowds physically moved through Glasgow. This completely eliminated the stagnant, dangerous bottlenecks that totally defined the old Sunday ritual. And that brings us to our final section, Section 4, a cultural scar. Of course, an intervention this drastic leaves a mark, right? To traditionalists, moving the Derby felt like losing a sacred heritage. I mean, this was the heavy, inevitable climax of a whole week's worth of excitement and speculation. But for city planners, this wasn't about ruining the fun, it was an act of pure survival. As you can see, the real trauma wasn't just the fan violence, it was the complete disruption of civic life for everyone else in Glasgow who was just trying to enjoy a quiet weekend. So where does that actually leave us today? Well, the sheer rarity of a Sunday derby now proves that authorities won the war of attrition. We live in an era of managed intensity. The old firm is carefully scheduled, it's heavily scrutinized, and it's highly controlled. The rivalry definitely still exists, but to endure, it had to learn a really difficult lesson. It has to operate within the boundaries of the modern city on a much tighter, safer pulse, rather than constantly pushing against them. But as we close out this explainer, we are left with a pretty provocative trade-off. By imposing this necessary, managed approach and curing the city of a severe sociological liability, did authorities inadvertently kill the very spirit of the game? Did stripping away that chaotic all-day buildup remove the raw, organic, high-stakes atmosphere that made the old firm the most feared and respected rivalry in world football? It's an incredibly fascinating tension between civic safety and raw cultural power. Thank you so much for exploring this case file with me today.